The words to that piece, Song of Silence, say, "If the song of my heart falls silent, sing to me." It speaks to how we bear witness to each other and remind each other of who we are. Our reflection back to the other is how we actually learn about ourselves. But this requires that we take a little risk. We have to be willing to show up authentically and be in relationship with other people. These days, our devices and our technology are making it easier and easier to kind of withdraw from each other. And we can present an image online that looks pretty perfect. And of course, it's natural and appropriate to be selective about how we present ourselves to the world. But we have to be careful that we don't hide our true selves behind our public presentation. The thing is, we know that when we come together with other people, it gets a lot harder to pull off the illusion of perfection. In the past, you've heard me use the analogy of the rock tumbler, that when we come together, we crash into each other and knock the rough edges off. And if we're willing to put ourselves in that vulnerable space, then with time we will get smoother and smoother. The more time we spend with others, the more risks we take, and the more those collisions are going to happen. It can be painful to be exposed for our shortcomings and flaws, and we know that the more we show up in community, the more that's going to happen. But without taking those risks, we don't give ourselves the opportunity to grow and open our hearts and our compassion. White scholar and philosopher Dr. Martha Nussbaum says, "Being a human means accepting promises from other people and trusting that other people will be good to you. When that is too much to bear, it is always possible to retreat into the thought, I'll live for my own comfort, my own revenge, my own anger, and I just won't be a member of society anymore." Martha says, that really means I won't be a human being anymore. And lately we're seeing this phenomena in our society where that isolation, that loss of desire and ability to live in community with others, to be real, to be seen, to give and take, creates this extreme imbalance. This is being played out over and over lately where people get so selfish they lose their compassion and humanity, and sometimes they even commit horrible acts of violence and mass destruction. Now, that's the extreme example, but each of us has to walk that line of privacy and guardedness, protection of ourselves versus the willingness to be seen and to be judged. Today, I want to explore what it means for our souls if we show up willing to be vulnerable in our relationships with others. I wrote the blurb for today's sermon a couple months ago. I look at Leah because she's always like, "Are you going to write those blurbs so we can pick some music?" Really proud. I wrote it a while ago, and it says, "Courageous vulnerability can actually be the key to self-awareness, trust building, and effective leadership." And at the time I wrote that, I thought, that sermon's going to be a piece of cake, because I love to read books by white research scientist Dr. Brene Brown on vulnerability just for fun. And there's so much richness and wisdom in them. I thought all I've got to do is tie Brene Brown's research and insights into our spiritual path as Unitarian Universalists. Totally up my alley. So I sat down earlier this week and began writing what I thought was a pretty decent exploration of how being willing to be vulnerable is actually a way to grow our souls and claim our power. Then one of my colleagues a couple days ago called and said, "Hey, I just preached on vulnerability too. Did you hear about how Brene Brown's work excludes the experience of people of color?" And I was like, oh no, what have I been missing? So she pointed me to some resources where I could learn more. White culture is the water we swim in, and I had not even considered what vulnerability might mean for people with marginalized identities. People of color, queer folks, people with disabilities, all experience true and perilous vulnerability in their everyday lives. So for those of us who have unearned privilege, that means we can read Brené Brown and work on becoming more brave and honest and vulnerable without ever having to consider our safety and well-being. Privilege means people like me get to take that for granted. It means I'm less likely to lose my job for making a mistake or showing my vulnerability than a Black or brown person might be. Dr. Jen Jackson, who describes themselves as a queer, gender flux, androgynous Black woman, an abolitionist, and a lover of all Black people, says, "White people having courage to finish that swim meet or ask for that big raise isn't like having the courage to be Black in a country that wants us dead." Dr. Jackson points out that an important piece of thinking about being authentic and vulnerable and taking risks and showing up in community is remembering that that looks different for different people. Suddenly, my piece of cake sermon became a lot more complicated. And that's what's going to happen if we truly are on the journey of dismantling white supremacy culture and living into the covenant of our eighth principle. It's going to come up when we don't expect it, and the challenge is, how do we respond? We're going to have these slightly embarrassing moments where we realize that we left some people out. People with marginalized identities are encouraging all of us to listen to more perspectives than just the white one, to spend our money and amplify the voices of the marginalized. And while Brené Brown's research is based on a diverse population sample, and even though she is personally committed to being anti-racist, she has come to realize that how she presents her work has been exclusionary. One day, her friend Tarana Burke, a Black woman and social justice activist and the founder of the Me Too movement, called Brené and invited her to collaborate on a book called You Are Your Best Thing: Vulnerability, Shame, Resilience, and the Black Experience. Now, I just found out about that book yesterday, so I didn't have a chance to read it yet, sorry. But it is going to be available for borrowing or buying at the Burnside Bookstall. Our first commercial in the middle of the sermon. I would encourage you all to check it out. So vulnerability is nuanced and a bit complicated, but it still can be used as a tool to keep us connected. There's an old Buddhist story called A Cup of Tea, and it goes like this. Once, a long time ago, there was a Zen master. People from far and near would seek his counsel and ask for his wisdom. Many would come and ask him to teach them, enlighten them in the way of Zen. He seldom turned anyone away. One day, an important man, a man used to being in charge of others, came to visit the master. "I've come today to ask you to teach me about Zen. Open my mind to enlightenment." The tone of the important man's voice revealed he was someone used to getting his own way. The Zen master smiled and said that they should discuss the matter over a cup of tea. When the tea was served, the master poured his visitor a cup. He poured, and the tea rose to the rim and began to spill over the table and finally onto the robes of the wealthy man. The visitor shouted, "Enough! You're spilling the tea all over. Can't you see this cup is full?" The master stopped pouring and smiled at his guest. "You are like this teacup, so full that nothing else can be added. Come back to me when the cup is empty. Come back to me with an empty mind." That man, used to privilege and power, arrived at the door of the Zen master already full, fully armored and ready to take control of the situation, just as he had been raised and conditioned to do. He'd been taught, like all of us from a young age, that his power could be maintained by his ability to stay in control and well-armored. How exhausting. But we all do it to some degree. But at what cost? What becomes possible if we are willing to be authentic, if we are willing to be seen, willing to share our art, our poetry, our quirkiness, willing to stand up for the underdog, to voice an unpopular opinion, to make a stupid mistake, willing to risk being discounted or even ignored. Is that stress worth exposing ourselves to other people's judgments? I've personally had to wrestle with that question quite a lot the last several years because I had this wacky idea that I wanted to be a UU minister. I loved the academics in seminary. I was excited to do social justice work and chaplaincy, pastoral care, and it was all fun and games until the fall of 2019 when I started my internship and I was supposed to lead worship at JUC. Now, JUC, Jefferson Unitarian, is a big church, like 800 members, and their services were live streamed before COVID to people in all kinds of other states. Like, we're talking hundreds of people. And suddenly, the reality of that public exposure and scrutiny that I had signed up for started to set in. I realized I was going to have to stand up in front of all those people and in front of that camera projecting me into people's homes and those smarty pants professors from the School of Mines that go to that church. And they were going to see that I was just a mom and a carriage driver and kind of a dork. And every insecurity or self-doubt that I'd ever entertained was right there whispering in my ear, Jenny, who do you think you are? You're not as smart as a real UU minister. Everybody's going to see the truth, which is you're not good enough. I was, you can ask Jason, an absolute basket case. But at that point, I had invested a lot in my training, and to turn back would have been a big deal. And I didn't want to give up, so I did it. And I did it, and I did it, and I did it again. And I'm pretty sure that if I was to go back and watch those early sermons that were probably more like book reports, they'd be pretty cringy. But I did it, and thank you, JUC, for putting up with me. And I survived, and I did it over and over until slowly I got more used to it. And I still hear those voices of self-doubt. I still feel like an imposter. But the key to being able to stand up here and do this is that I've stopped trying to create the illusion that I'm perfect. What a relief. Nobody was buying it anyway. Perfectionism is tremendously stressful. And not only that, it's impossible. So it requires so much critical thinking and analysis of ourselves and others. And it's really painful to hear when somebody thinks that we got it wrong. Our amygdalas give us big feelings of shame and embarrassment so that we will notice and be motivated to change course. We feel our mistakes and our regret in our chest, in our throats. Sometimes we feel angry or defensive and definitely exposed. And I'm sorry, but those moments are meant to feel terrible. That's how we're wired. And our willingness to feel those excruciating feelings is actually good for us. Being willing to be uncomfortable is a spiritual practice that we are committed to here at Columbine and as Unitarian Universalists. Our third principle is our covenant acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. If we take that seriously, that means we let people be where they're at with different perspectives and opinions than our own. This requires willingness, open-heartedness, and vulnerability. To live into our fourth principle, which is a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, requires admitting we haven't got it all figured out yet, and we still have room to grow. Our UU faith is an invitation for people to try out a little vulnerability, a little uncertainty. It's a bit of a trust fall. Attending a small group discussion of white supremacy culture and white fragility takes courage. It takes exposure to risk. But because you all have been willing to risk feeling these confusing, unsettling, and unpleasant feelings, you all have grown. At Columbine, we will continue to bump up against each other and each other's flaws in the messiness of this journey. Our faith requires that we embrace a paradox. We are enough, and we are committed to growth. We love and accept each other as we are, and we still dream of beloved community. Our UU faith invites us to wonder what will happen when we love and accept ourselves and each other. Will we learn to laugh at ourselves a little bit more? Will we discover the liberation of letting our quirky selves love what we love and be who we are? Pet pigs, whatever weird stuff you're into. So let's not wait until we have reached level 427 of maturity and social graces and wokeness to show up and be here with each other, because this is it. There is no dress rehearsal. These days of our precious lives are actually numbered. We don't know what that number is, but time's a-wastin'. So may we find our courage to show up as our authentic selves and find our way through that anxiety and the imposter syndrome to the promised land of power and resilience that comes from loving ourselves just as we are. Blessed be, and may it be so.